Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW. Layered Insight is the industry's first embedded security approach for containers. Trusted by Global 1000 enterprises to secure their containerized applications, it's the only solution that requires no root privileges, has zero dependency on the underlying infrastructure, and is fully portable across any container environment. Unified DevOps and SecOps, enabling the rapid development of containerized applications without worrying about security. To learn more, please visit layeredinsight.com/ASW.
Welcome back, everyone, to Application Security Weekly. Just a few announcements before we jump into the news. First, go out to itpro.tv/securityweekly and use the code securityweekly30 to try a free 7-day trial and receive 30% off your monthly membership for the lifetime of your active subscription. In addition to that, I just wanted to announce that Paul Security Weekly here has recently added the State of Security Education and Training webcast in conjunction with IT Pro TV and Roger Williams University to the content made available on demand at securityweekly.com/on-demand. There's a lot of really awesome content over there, Paul. I don't know, for those that are listening, I'd be curious to know if you'd set up that security onion to see how many people are driving traffic to that site, because there is some really amazing content by some really awesome companies.
Yeah, I mean, I like those webcasts. So, I mean, because I did them with other people, but I think they're awesome and people should totally watch them. Please go watch them. Check them out. For sure. I know it's a little extra effort, like you got to go to the website and register quick for them, but it's totally worth it.
Yeah, and the fact that you can go back and watch ones that have previously been given, so it's not like you have to carve out time of your day because this is a one-off that is only given if you go live. You get an opportunity to go and look at some of the on-demand content that has been given live, I'm sure, but at the end of the day, it gives you an opportunity to consume it on your own schedule. The last announcement that I have before the news is that BugCrowd is hiring. BugCrowd is my employer. So after closing our Series C funding, we are now expanding quite a lot to grow and escalate the size of our organization to expand our reach. So to that end, go to bugcrowd.com/careers or email me hoodie@securityweekly.com if you have questions about any of the positions that you see there. So with that, Paul, I'm sure you probably talked about it last night on Paul Security Weekly. What about this AMD breach?
Yeah,
we tried. Not AMD breach, but processor bugs.
We really missed you on Security Weekly last night because we talked a lot about bug bounties and vulnerabilities and exploits in the marketplace for them. So you were sorely missed. And we tried to talk about this AMD flaw, but no one had really had time because I was at a conference. No one really had time because it broke kind of not that long ago, so we didn't have much time to research it. So I was really hoping you had a good explanation at a high level what's going on with this AMD thing.
Yeah. So there are 13 vulnerabilities. I didn't dive deep into each specific one other than to say a few things. So Dan Guido at Trail of Bits was actually contacted by a company called CTS Labs from Tel Aviv. And they did some research on AMD's Ryzen and EPYC processors and basically said, hey, guys at Trail of Bits, I know that you're well known for your security assurance and security testing. I think they did some of the Cyber Grand Challenge stuff at DEF CON last year. And so they had them basically validate that the vulnerabilities that they were looking at were, in fact, real. And Dan has been quoted as coming back and saying, it makes a bad compromise worse. And yes, these are actually very real vulnerabilities. So to that end, what it effectively is the Ryzen and Ryzen Pro chipsets that are currently shipping have exploitable backdoors that effectively, as CTS is saying, could not have passed even the most rudimentary white box security review, and yet somehow are making it directly into those chipsets. I don't know if all of the vulnerabilities are necessarily related to backdoors, but effectively the set of vulnerabilities or the backdoors that have been found require you to get a footprint on the device first before you can go ahead and make changes to the chipset and the firmware. But this is effectively a second stage attack here. So you get onto a server, you get onto a system with one of these Ryzen or EPYC processors. And then from there, the vulnerabilities that exist today allow you to get a permanent footprint on the device at a layer, so effectively below the kernel, like down at firmware level ring 0, that you can now persist on the device perpetually. So it's a lot worse than the concepts of Spectre and Meltdown, and it's totally different than the speculative execution that existed for those vulnerabilities. These are actual like vulnerabilities where now you can change the firmware to give a permanent backdoor to whomever is out there that has now exploited these vulnerabilities, which is kind of scary. It's like, okay, first of all, why aren't you checking the firmware for vulnerabilities? Because that's real important. And secondly, if you are, how did these get past your testing regimen? Paul, really curious to get your thoughts here, because I know that we talk a lot about things like hard-coded passwords and what have you, but to have backdoors almost directly into the firmware for these chipsets is ludicrous.
Yeah, and the discussion's interesting because, of course, Linus Torvalds, whenever he looks at anything security, is like, well, that's just stupid. And that's basically what he said about this vulnerability. He said if you replace the BIOS or the CPU microcode with an evil version, you might have a security problem. And is that essentially the vulnerabilities in firmware essentially allow you to replace the firmware or backdoor to control it in some way? And is
and execute that from like an admin or a root privilege level, right? Like you are talking now to the device like post boot up. It's not even like you have to wait for it to reboot to actually install malicious code. It's you're installing it while the system is running, and then once the system reboots, it's yours.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting. I don't know. I'm just trying. The article that we covered was about what people thought about this vulnerability, and someone says, "Well, hey, if I found a flaw in all the hardware space, no device is secure. If you have physical access, you can just pick it up and walk away." Am I a security expert yet? I think there's a lot of confusion about these exposures and what it means from a risk perspective, and it kind of calls into question like, how do we separate the hardware layer from the software layer? How do we prevent an attacker from getting on the operating system level, maybe controlling the kernel, from then going deeper? And what levels of control do we have in place in order to protect against that? Certainly, if you've listened to our previous 2 interviews with experts in this area, 2 members of the UEFI forum that came on the show recently, they talk about the trusted computing model and how there is a facility for, in the UEFI case, to validate these updates so that you can't maliciously, and that's a huge concern for UEFI. Now, of course, not everyone has adopted UEFI or all the mechanisms to basically validate this code. It's, I think, similar to how you can't push out an update and say that you're Microsoft and push software onto the operating system. I think largely those facilities either don't exist or aren't widely adopted when we talk about the various platform firmware or firmware that exists inside of our hardware. And it sounded to me like that was the gist of this vulnerability, which is almost less about the resiliency or security of your code, but more about protecting the update process for these particular firmwares.
And exactly to that point, the white paper that is actually associated with this announcement of the vulnerabilities actually calls out that these backdoors were supposedly put in place by a Taiwanese manufacturer, ASM Media, or AS Media, which is a subsidiary of Asus Tech, which basically filed recently for, or rather I should say was recently fined by the FTC for ignoring hardware vulnerabilities. So effectively, the parent company that owns AS Media has been fined, and then AS Media puts in these backdoors into the code, into the firmware code, right? So it brings up a lot of kind of interesting thought experiment questions as well, because I know that companies like Google are going toward the zero trust network model, right, where you authenticate at the endpoint or at the application at every step of the way in appropriate locations. It's an interesting world to live in that you have to start thinking about, what if I can't trust the processor or the system that my software is now living on? Like, how do you check for authenticity as well as, in this case, how do you authenticate transactions or processes on a device that has this level of vulnerability? It brings up a whole new set of problems.
Yeah, and I think some of the criticism comes from just like grossly overstating the problem, right? In saying stuff like this is as bad as it gets in the world of security. Not necessarily. I still need to have access to the system in the first place,
Right.
and then execute, the attack, which is only specific to these particular chipsets as well,
Right.
which are not
Right.
as widespread as an operating system such as Windows, as an example, right? So,
Well,
like I can see where it's going to draw criticism because like the level of badness here needs to be evaluated in the grand scheme of things. And in the grand scheme of things, a remote exploit for something like Windows is way worse than this. And now what the threat is, that people can keep access potentially undetected by doing this. But now that we know how the attacks work, I'm sure someone can help people detect this style of attack. But the larger question is, how do we validate these various updates, right? I mean, we've talked about BIOS attacks for a long time. I think the technology and processes exist to be able to validate updates. Like I said, Microsoft validates their updates. Why can't we validate them for all these other components in the system?
Right. And to that end as well, it's a situation of it takes one bad phishing attack for you to get ransomware, or even worse, get, backdoored onto the firmware so you can get ransomware again and again and again. So it definitely is a situation where we need better code signing checks. We need better gateways or toll booths, for lack of a better term, to walk through the process of validating updates and making sure that, in this case, even the most privileged users can't perform these kind of changes, perhaps while the system is actively running, until a restart occurs and maybe requires some sort of local access before it hits the network, right? So these are all situations and problems that we need to start thinking about, especially in light of hardware vulnerabilities.
And what's interesting is I think we need to look at the vulnerabilities and say, well, if there's a backdoor, does it allow you to bypass the code signing? Like, can you, in an unauthorized manner, gain access to the firmware and make changes that bypass any kind of code signing or checks and balances that are on the system to make sure that an evil bad guy is not replacing firmware? It is very timely, as we just had these conversations with the folks from UEFI, and specifically Dick Wilkins last night. I know for a fact we talked about that. Like, what are their major concerns with security? And that's certainly one of them that they talk about a lot. So,
for sure. And to that end, I mean, speaking of potentials for breach, right? So apparently, I don't know if you heard about this, Paul. There's a cryptocurrency company called Binance. I thought
that was Beyonce. That's not Beyonce's cryptocurrency. No, different.
I don't know about that, Paul, but if it is, let me know. Because in this case, Binance, cryptocurrency exchange, is putting up $250,000 as a bounty, not for a bug or flaw in their cryptocurrency exchange, but as a way of enticing someone to come forward and
put a ring on it?
Information on the hacker. Yeah, they put a bounty on the hacker that actually tried to break into their systems back on February 7th. Which I think is like, suddenly we need to get Dog the Bounty Hunter all up in here to track down these malicious hackers and go ahead and try and, get a $250,000 reward for attempted hacking of Binance. And I should correct the date. It was February 22nd that there was an attempted attack. The thing that I found really interesting about this article, though, and this is article number, let's see here, 4 under the bugs, breaches, and more section of the notes, is that they have two-factor authentication available for Binance. But even for those that have it set up, it's a 30-second reset, which is pretty normal for like a Google Authenticator or something of that nature. But once you took the code, you could generate an API key and access it at any time without two-factor authentication thereafter, which I thought was kind of the real crux of the problem here. Is you breach someone with a phishing attack, you get the code, you are able to use it for, the 20 seconds remaining. And then all you got to do is just generate one API key with their account, and then you're done. You can now go and access this at any point in the future, which tells us a lot about the problem of API keys, right? There's API keys now are effectively all or nothing. And there's no good ways today to gateway which functionality they're allowed to use without reintroducing second factor authentication as part of that process. What are your thoughts there, Paul?
I don't have any thoughts on that. Sorry.
I mean, it's okay.
I'm no help. I'm no help there.
Well, so jumping into it, I mean, APIs, right? They're the sort of thing that a lot of people have available today for integration purposes. It's allowing you to be able to build third-party applications to leverage this sort of platform. And today, I mean, we've done a lot of work in web application space to say, okay, re-authenticate when they try to check out, or re-authenticate with second factor when they try to transfer money. But to this end, it's the problem of APIs is that there's no way to say, okay, allow for this set of functionality with this API key, unless I give them a second API key to do a second set of functionality. There's no way for me to intercept the process to say, you must provide a second factor to perform that action with an API key. It's you can do it or you can't. It's a binary state. And we really need to work toward either, I don't know if somebody does this, and if somebody does, write in hoodie@securityweekly.com. I'd love to know about it, but some way of getting in the middle of that process for a certain functionality where you can require second factor authentication, because that would effectively have saved a lot of their customers that were in fact attacked during this. The interesting part that I thought was somewhat strange about the whole situation is Binance has an automated system to block all withdrawals, including, in this case, the attempts by the phishers themselves to make off with intended funds. It sounds like what they've built is they have built a emergency shutoff valve when too many transactions are attempting to take place at once, which I thought was interesting because that effectively is trying to prevent market crashes of their system rather than really to prevent automated attacks like this. I'm sure you probably have some thoughts there, Paul.
Yeah, I encourage our listeners last night, or we talked about last night. I encourage our listeners to go read that article we talked about from Robert Graham at the ErrataSec blog, and he talked about basically he was covering John Oliver's take on cryptocurrency, but brought up some really interesting things about cryptocurrency in general, currency in general, and also when we theorize about how we can make cryptocurrencies more secure to validate the transaction, how some of those ideas kind of like make it not a valid point to be like you missing the point of cryptocurrency if you're going to start building in all these other checks and balances and or validating that the person is really them. Like that's the whole point, is that it's somewhat of an anonymous transaction. I thought his article was really great in explaining some of those high level areas. I also think the cryptocurrency is out of control. Like everyone has their own cryptocurrency now. It's ODB from Wu-Tang has they started a cryptocurrency around ODB. Like it's just ridiculous.
Is it Wu-Tang for life?
It is.
Financial.
There's some joke in there about cash rules everything around me. Cryptocurrency rules everything around me. Something like that.
Right. More money, more problems. I don't know. That's not Wu-Tang.
It is not. It is not. More cryptocurrency, more problems.
Indeed. And so it's funny, actually. So not an article we highlighted this week, but I thought it was still an interesting point to make, was apparently Google is banning all ads for cryptocurrency as of something like June this year. So I think as I commented on Twitter, I retweeted it and said, looks like the hype is over because Google's blocking ads on it, then yeah, good luck finding it, right? Unless you go out to somebody else. And maybe this is the time for Yahoo to make a resurgence because you can start advertising your cryptocurrency on Yahoo. I would like royalties on that idea, by the way, if Yahoo decides to do that. So,
well, I mean, it's interesting. The whole ad thing is really interesting. Like, you tend to think about free speech and getting my word out there, and how if I do want to get a message out there about something that the large players like Google and Facebook decide, no, we're not going to let you advertise on that, or we're not going to allow that content. It kind of begs the question, like, how much power do they really have? Now, what some will say is that, well, you can just create a bunch of accounts and generate some attention without necessarily taking out ads. Ads give you kind of like that shortcut to get your message out, but big players will heavily filter those ads. So things like tobacco, guns, alcohol, now cryptocurrency, they filter out spam and malicious stuff, obviously, right? But what constitutes that? I think it's kind of scary how much power they have, and it may not be today, but certainly, in the future, I think that could be a big issue.
Well, it's funny that cryptocurrency makes it onto that list of guns, booze, tobacco.
Right?
It's like suddenly cryptocurrency is in the realm of badness. That suddenly maybe we need like what is the health organization that gives warnings on tobacco and stuff, right? Like put a warning label on cryptocurrency. Warning may suddenly crash and you lose all your money. So. Moving on though, Paul, I wanted to cover a couple of other stories here before we wrap up for the week.
Oh, I just want to make sure we covered Barkley because I talked with them. And our friend Not Kevin works there.
Yeah,
are you familiar with Barkley? They're a Boston-based company.
Yeah. Yep. So,
they did the MailChimp analysis. So I like their article better than the one that's linked to. So the article in the show notes links to the full blog post from Barkley, which I haven't read in its entirety, but basically take control of MailChimp accounts in a phishing campaign. A phishing campaign? Some kind of campaign that includes all kinds of good stuff that they did a great job writing up, it looks like. So
awesome. Yeah, and needless to say, Not Kevin is a great person, and Barkley is doing some really good write-up on this stuff. So yeah, effectively what it was is that with MailChimp, compromised accounts were being used to set up campaigns that would upload a list of like 250,000 people, distribute malware, and then that list would be deleted or that campaign would be deleted from the person's account, so they never even knew that it was run. The only way that you can detect this, I guess, is if you have someone monitoring when campaigns are started and like what the size of those campaigns are, so that you can get an idea of, oh, my account must be compromised because suddenly I have a 6,000 campaign, 6,000 database of people and accounts that I'm trying to hit, and now it's 250,000 that it's sending out something to. I mean, not to mention, I'm sure the bill that these people will probably get as a result. Which itself will be interesting to see how that all goes. So I did want to move on, though, to just quickly announce that Let's Encrypt is actually now allowing for wildcard certificates. So if you're like me and you own a top-level domain and you want to start setting off some subdomains like blog.securityweekly.com or wiki.securityweekly.com and use one certificate from Let's Encrypt, you can. So they actually require you to use their Acme V2 protocol, which is it requires a DNS text record to actually demonstrate that you own the domain itself. So I thought that was kind of cool to see them coming out with that because, let's face it, especially after we talked about Trustico, I think it was last week or the week before, and all of those certificate issues, it's good to see Let's Encrypt coming out and addressing some of these certificate authority space problems in a nice way. The other one that I wanted to cover as well, which I thought was similar to what we were discussing earlier with the attack deploy tool, is Voodoo Kali, which is effectively the ability to run Kali Linux applications using XFCE desktop environment in the Windows subsystem for Linux. So you are effectively able to run more or less natively on Windows all of the desktop environment for your Kali Linux system and all of the tools that sit within Kali Linux. So that is article number 2 under the "If you build it, they will come." I don't know, Paul. It's a little weird to live in a world where Linux and Windows are living on the same system together. It's kind of scary.
Yeah, I talk about that in my talk for sure. And I think it's kind of, I don't know. Maybe it's a segment or something. But there's so many different ways to run all these tools. Like you can run a VM, you can have a separate box, you can use Docker, you can use the Windows subsystem for Linux. Like there's 8 million ways now to like run these tools and deploy them, and what's the best for you is the question. What's the differences between them? Like what are the advantages of running it via Docker or running it in the Windows subsystem for Linux, or like I don't know.
It'd be interesting to see as well if somebody decides to take the security onion stuff and do the same sort of thing, right? Like suddenly you can run it all on the Windows subsystem for Linux, and you have your Windows server deployed that has the WSL, and then suddenly you're doing all of your security onion tooling natively in Windows. That would be crazy and awesome all at once. So who knows? Maybe that could be another project, Paul, for you to take on and release. Yeah,
I know. It's hard enough getting running under Linux, never mind trying to put Linux on Windows to run all these tools. Yeah, almost said thanks.
We'll leave that to maybe some of our developer and application security listeners to come out with. And just, feel free to give us a thanks in your talk at Black Hat Arsenal next year when you decide to get that up and running.
Right.
So one other thing that I wanted to cover before we jumped into the food for thought is there was actually a really cool open source tool for generating cross-site scripting payload polyglots using deep learning. So I thought that this was kind of a neat way to use the machine learning and artificial intelligence to build attack payloads that effectively work pretty intelligently against a lot of different systems, whether it's built on Java or it's .NET or what have you. So that is article number 3 under the "If you build it, they will come." It's a little weird, Paul. Again, living in a world that we've always kind of had this, oh, machine learning, oh, artificial intelligence, like hand wave. It's all just buzzwords. But here's an application of that sort of deep learning technology for the attacker side, which I think for a while, a lot of people have been saying, wait until the attackers start using this technology to actually attack systems. I don't know that anyone's ready to handle this. What do you think?
I was reading some of your other articles on developer streams and how like a small percentage of Reddit users cause all the conflicts. But what I thought was interesting, former Equifax executive charged with insider trading, which is something we all speculated about. It's interesting. Now they're just charged with it. They haven't been convicted yet, but they did charge someone with insider trading, which I think is kind of interesting.
Jumping to that, maybe to round out the show, it's interesting because as a security professional and as a developer today, right, you have to stop and think about what are the bugs that I know about in my organization, whether they're vulnerabilities or they're actual just bugs that could lead to a stock devaluation that I know about. Mm-hmm. The fact that you could be charged for insider trading because you exercise your stock options prior to this information becoming public can be a real problem, especially for the developer community, right? Because they're the ones that are fixing all the bugs. They have the JIRA tickets that they're assigned. And there's a very clear trace of when that was assigned and when they would know about it. Mm-hmm. So I know that, so a major, usually like VPs and CEOs and people that have, kind of large standing in an organization tend to do either pre-announcements of stock sale or will have a kind of blind trust that they put it in. I wonder if for a majority of people that work in the security space, if that will eventually become the sort of thing that they need to do. What are your thoughts there, Paul?
Well, I think certainly, pre-announcing it could certainly help a lot of the controversy, right? Although there's going to be some kind of trail that they're going to go after, and certain indicators that they're going to look for. This was certainly a case where something this major, and it all depends on the timing, right? Like, at what point does a developer realize there's a bug, and who do they tell, and how is it tracked, and how do you know if that's really going to affect the stock price, so that if you do sell it, like, there's a whole bunch of issues around that. I like your take on it, that sometimes developers and security people to a certain extent do know about these things, and what is their reporting chain up to management? When do they find out about them? And certainly it's unethical to say, well, crap, this is going to really devalue our stock, so I better sell it now. Like, that's just, hopefully you're going to get caught doing that, every single time.
Yeah. And who knows, right? Because usually it ends up being one of the bigger heads that rolls here from an SEC perspective, right? It's not going to be the developer that was assigned the ticket. It's going to be his VP, who had probably more stock to sell, but still the developer could benefit from that kind of knowledge, it's a dangerous kind of slippery slope here that it'll be interesting to see, because to the extent that they are abusing their privilege is definitely something that I want to see the SEC go after. But at what point is insider trading, and who is going to be potentially liable for it? The last thing I will mention, though, and because you mentioned it, is ending on a positive note. For those of you that like to develop or are interested in maybe getting into development from the security side, I did link in story number 2 under food for thought a GitHub, or I think it's a GitHub page that is awesome developer streams. So you can go out and watch live streams of people that are doing development and working on code projects. It gives you a breakdown of the different languages and frameworks and libraries that they work in. I thought that was really cool, especially to see that people are now live streaming development. I mean, to some degree, you'd think development can be boring, but who knows? Maybe this will build positive communities around different development structures. So I thought that was cool to link for people to check out.
That's pretty funny. So you actually get to watch them like write code and stuff?
Yeah, and it sounds like they probably kind of, almost like shoutcasting for video games, right? Or people that are live streaming on Twitch. It's effectively they're live streaming on their code.
That's pretty funny. That's cool.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, thank you everyone for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to git, commit, and stay classy.